You're about to watch a moment that completely flipped the energy inside a Senate hearing. And it all started with a question so simple, it shouldn't have been controversial. But what followed turned into one of the most uncomfortable exchanges we've seen in a long time. Because this wasn't about budgets anymore. It wasn't about politics. It became a direct confrontation over something much bigger, the Constitution itself. And at the center of it was a single line that left the room stunned. Have you even read it? At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary.
Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Director Patel. And so, as I understood it, you testified yesterday that you'd like to have another $1 billion added on to the FY25 level to do the additional work you'd like to do on drug interdiction, fentanyl in general, and anti-terrorism. And today you gave us a budget that requests cutting $500 million. Which is it? Do you want us? What are you asking of this committee? To add funds, add $1 billion, or to cut $500 million?
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the opportunity. What I'm asking for is that with more, I can simply do more. And I was giving examples of what more I could do. I can do the mission, and I'm am in support of the budget here, and I'm working with appropriators and you to fill the gaps.
So you support the budget presented that cuts $500 million, but you also support us adding $1 billion should we choose to do that?
Well, I can't not support the budget as proposed, because then I would be supporting no budget.
Okay. Well, we've got those two options. We do look forward to further details from you about how you plan to modify the function of FBI on these different missions that you've highlighted today, so that we can give it the appropriate consideration. Mm-hmm. Director Patel, you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, Senator.
And it is really the freedom clause of the United States. It was 4 years into being a nation when Congress and the states said, hey, we have to make sure that there's not an over-aggressive government in the future that deprives us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you're familiar that that applies to all persons in the United States.
Yes, Senator.
So there's been a lot of concern about the several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets of America and sent to El Salvador without due process. And does that concern you?
Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not they were given or not given due process or are supposed to be afforded due process. All the FBI did and all the FBI will continue to do is arrest those that have violated the law.
Okay, but to arrest, you have to investigate. Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization.
Well, that was my first question, whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it. It is your job to investigate crimes.
Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
Again, Senator, it's not for me to call the balls and strikes on it. The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls.
So you have no influence over whether an investigation is opened?
I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law.
But your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process. I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you.
You haven't read the Constitution? It says all persons.
I've got it right here, but what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant.
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. It says no person.
It doesn't say that.
It does say no person. Yeah, I'll encourage you to read it, because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court repeatedly. On the case of Miranda versus Arizona, held the right of all individuals, regardless of citizenship status, the Supreme Court in Reno versus Flores. I mean, but it's the plain language of the Constitution. It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution.
As the first public defender who's ever served at the FBI as its director, I am more aware of due process than any predecessor in my seat. You are delineating between removal proceedings and criminal acts. My job is to investigate criminal acts. That's what we do.
You are aware that the Fifth Amendment refers to taking away liberty, and when people are arrested on the street, detained and sent out of the country, that their liberty has been taken away.
Senator, that is a constitutional question that you are asking me to answer. It's not for me to answer.
The question has already been answered by the Supreme Court that they're protected, therefore it's a violation of law, and it's your responsibility to open an investigation, and you're saying today you will not do so?
I am not the agency involved in removal proceedings. That is a different branch of government.
So if an agency other than the FBI violates the law and the Constitution, you will not investigate because it's a different agency?
I will investigate every violation of law.
Well, you have, but you just said you're not investigating.
No. You and I are in disagreement on what is a violation of law. I have yet to hear from the Supreme Court your position as you have adjudicated it.
Well, very, very interesting, because the Supreme Court's been very clear, and I had heard you were trained in the law, so I expected maybe you would try to uphold it. You also took an oath to the Constitution.
Thank you for the reminder.
Well, it's important to remind you, since you're apparently unfamiliar with the very basics of the core protection of freedom in our Constitution.
What I am familiar with is protecting the American public, and that's what
Let me close with one question, Mr. Chairman. Will you make sure that due process in every action of the FBI is completely honored under your time as director?
Will I ensure that due process is followed?
Yes.
Under the Constitution?
Completely. Send that message throughout the FBI that due process must be followed, is constitutionally required. Make sure that it's done under your direction.
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
Kash Patel sat in front of the committee, composed, controlled, answering questions the way officials in Washington always do. Careful language. Safe responses. The kind of answers that don't create headlines. The discussion started where most hearings do: funding, priorities, strategy. Even when pressed on a confusing budget request, he kept things smooth, explaining that more funding would allow more work, while also supporting the current proposal. It was the usual balancing act. Nothing explosive, nothing unexpected. But then, without raising his voice or making a dramatic shift, Jeff Merkley changed the entire direction of the conversation. Instead of continuing with policy, he pivoted to something foundational. Something that doesn't depend on opinion or interpretation in the same way political issues do. He brought up the Fifth Amendment, not as a technical legal concept, but as what he called the Freedom Clause. And that wording mattered, because it reframed the conversation instantly. This wasn't about legal theory anymore. It was about basic rights, the kind that are supposed to apply to everyone. And that's where things started to tighten. The Fifth Amendment, at its core, is straightforward. It says that no person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Not citizens, not certain groups. It says no person. That distinction is critical, and Merkley leaned into it hard. He began referencing concerns, controversial ones, widely debated, about individuals being detained and removed without what critics argue was proper due process. Now, to be clear, there are different perspectives on what actually happened in those cases. Some reports claim violations, others argue procedures were followed. But Merkley wasn't trying to settle that debate in that moment. He was asking something more fundamental: that if there is even a possibility that constitutional rights were violated, shouldn't that be investigated? It sounds like a basic question, but the answer didn't come easily. Instead of engaging directly, Patel shifted. He said he wasn't in a position to comment, that he didn't necessarily agree with the characterization, that it wasn't his role to make that kind of determination. And just like that, the tone changed. Because now it wasn't just about the issue, it was about responsibility. The man sitting there wasn't just any official. He was expected to lead the FBI, the country's top investigative agency. And yet, when asked about a potential violation of the highest law in the country, his answer created distance instead of clarity. Merkley didn't let it slide. He pressed again, narrowing the focus. Not asking about policy, not asking about politics, asking whether Patel would launch an investigation into what some describe as a violation of due process. And again, the response circled back to deflection. Not my call, not my role. The decision belongs to others within the agency. That's when the tension really started to build, because what was unfolding wasn't just a disagreement, it was a pattern. Agreement with the importance of the Constitution on one hand, but hesitation to act when it might be challenged on the other. And Merkley saw that gap clearly. So he pushed harder. He pointed out something that's often overlooked in debates like this. You don't need to be a constitutional scholar to understand the plain language of the document. It's written to be clear, direct, accessible. And then came the moment that changed everything. He said it sounded like Patel hadn't even read it. That line hit like a shockwave. You could feel the room react, even through the screen. Because that's not just criticism, that's a direct challenge to credibility, to preparedness, to whether someone is truly ready to uphold the responsibilities they're asking for. Patel pushed back, emphasizing his background and his understanding of due process. But the tension didn't ease. If anything, it intensified, because Merkley wasn't arguing abstract theory. He was pointing to established interpretations, to decades of legal precedent where courts have affirmed that due process applies broadly. He even referenced well-known cases, not to overwhelm, but to reinforce that this isn't a new or unclear concept. It's something that has been settled repeatedly. And yet, the answer remained cautious, distant, unwilling to fully engage. At that point, the exchange stopped being about a single issue and started reflecting something bigger. A deeper divide over how responsibility is defined within powerful institutions. Patel leaned into the idea that certain matters fall under different agencies. That immigration enforcement, for example, involves processes outside the FBI's direct control. And on a technical level, that's accurate. Government functions are divided for a reason. But Merkley's argument cut past that structure. If a constitutional violation occurs, does it matter which agency was involved? Or does the responsibility to investigate transcend those boundaries? That question lingered, and it didn't get a clear answer. Instead, what viewers saw was something more subtle but just as impactful, a reliance on complexity, on process, on the idea that certain questions are too nuanced, too layered, to be answered directly in a moment like this. And for some watching, that raised concerns. Because when something as fundamental as due process starts to feel complicated or conditional, it changes how people view the system as a whole. Now, it's important to acknowledge that there are multiple perspectives here. Some argue that enforcement situations require flexibility, that real-world conditions don't always fit neatly into legal frameworks. Others push back, saying that the entire purpose of the Constitution is to set firm boundaries, especially in moments where it would be easier not to. And that tension between flexibility and consistency is at the heart of this debate. But what made this exchange stand out wasn't just the disagreement. It was the way it exposed that tension in real time. You had one side insisting that the language is clear, that the responsibility is obvious, that action should follow concern. And you had the other side emphasizing process, structure, and limitations of role. Neither position is simple. Neither is without support. But when those two approaches collide in a setting like this, the result is exactly what you saw. Friction that's impossible to ignore. And then there's the broader conversation that this moment tapped into. There's been growing discussion, especially online, about whether institutions sometimes avoid accountability by distributing responsibility so widely that no single entity is forced to act. It's not a claim that's universally accepted, and it's not something that's been definitively proven. But it's a perception that's gaining traction. The idea that when everyone has a role, it becomes easier for no one to take ownership. That's what some viewers saw in this exchange. Not a refusal to act outright, but a hesitation grounded in structure, in process, in waiting for someone else to make the first move. And for critics, that raises a serious question. Because if the enforcement of constitutional rights depends on clear lines of responsibility, what happens when those lines blur? What happens when accountability becomes a moving target? By the end of the exchange, the original topic, immigration, enforcement, due process, had almost faded into the background. What remained was something much more fundamental. A question about the role of leadership within institutions like the FBI, about whether the responsibility to uphold the Constitution is active or reactive, immediate or conditional. Merkley framed it in a way that was hard to ignore. The Constitution isn't a suggestion. It's not a guideline that can be interpreted differently depending on the situation. It's the law. And if that's true, then the expectation isn't just agreement. It's enforcement. Patel, on the other hand, maintained a position that reflected caution, a reluctance to step outside defined boundaries, a focus on process over interpretation. And while that approach has its own logic, especially within large institutions, it didn't fully address the urgency that Merkley was pressing. And that's why this moment resonated, because it didn't offer a clean resolution. It didn't end with a clear answer or a decisive conclusion. Instead, it left viewers with something more powerful, a question that extends far beyond that room. Who is responsible for protecting constitutional rights when concerns arise? Is it the courts? The agencies? The individuals leading those agencies? Or is it a shared responsibility that requires someone to step forward first? That uncertainty is what keeps this moment alive. What makes people go back and watch it again? What drives the conversation long after the hearing ends? Because at its core, this isn't just about one exchange or one issue. It's about how systems respond when they're tested, about whether principles hold firm under pressure or become flexible in practice. And that's something people are paying closer attention to than ever before. Now the question shifts to you. After watching this unfold, do you think the response we heard was reasonable given the complexity of the issue? Or does it raise concerns about how seriously these protections are being enforced when it matters most? Let me know what you think down in the comments, because this is one of those debates where every perspective adds something important to the conversation. And if you want more breakdowns like this, where we go beyond the surface and show you what's really happening inside these high-stakes moments, make sure you hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.